At 9:47 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Commander Joseph Roffert found himself in the dim, windowless basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a place chilled almost to discomfort to protect the rows of IBM tabulating machines lining the walls. In front of him stretched a massive map of the Pacific Ocean, a chaotic sea of colored pins and greased pencil markings, each one representing an American warship operating within 1,000 miles of Midway Atoll. Roffert had not slept in 36 hours. His eyes burned, bloodshot from the endless hours of scrutinizing intercepted Japanese radio transmissions. A constant throb pulsed in his head, fueled by caffeine and exhaustion, and he couldn't remember the last time he had eaten a proper meal. But none of that mattered. Nothing mattered more than the next 90 minutes. Somewhere far to the west, American dive bombers were already airborne, navigating over an empty expanse of ocean with only a narrow margin of fuel and no landmarks to guide them. Within an hour and a half, they would either find the Japanese fleet or turn back, spent and out of options. If they succeeded, the United States Navy might yet survive. If they failed, Japan could dominate the Pacific for a decade. Roffert understood the stakes because for 6 months, he and his team at Station Hypo had worked relentlessly to break Japan's most secure naval code, JN-25B. They slept in shifts that blurred day into night, ate at their desks, argued over fragments of messages that slowly began to form a coherent picture. Bit by bit, the Japanese strategy emerged. The approaching force was massive, unprecedented in scale. For fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, 42 destroyers. He knew the composition, the timing, and the objective, all because he had penetrated a code Japan believed unbreakable. But intelligence alone could not win a battle. Even knowing exactly where the enemy would strike meant nothing if the American pilots failed to find them. The Japanese assumed such a feat impossible. For months, their admirals dismissed American capability, convinced that the U.S. Navy was undisciplined, poorly trained, and incapable of sophisticated operations at sea. Japanese pilots, believing themselves superior in spirit, tactics, and endurance, had their confidence reinforced by a string of victories. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore collapsed in just over 2 months. And the Philippines, though resisting longer, eventually succumbed. Everywhere Japan advanced, Allied forces retreated, and the Japanese planners, it seemed inevitable. Even Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had spent years in the United States, studying at Harvard after the First World War and later serving as naval attaché in Washington, underestimated the Americans. He understood the industry, politics, and society of the United States, yet he assumed American naval officers were complacent, overly comfortable, and unprofessional. These assumptions shaped his planning. At Midway, he believed American carriers would remain tied to predictable routines, that their response would be cautious and conventional. Confident in Japanese superiority, he scattered his fleet across millions of square miles, assuming no one could detect them in time. This overconfidence had already cost Japan early in the war. On the night of December 7, 1941, hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese destroyer Sazanami and Ushio attacked Midway under cover of darkness. They fired on Sand Island at 9:31 p.m., expecting little resistance. No air cover, no reconnaissance, no battleships backing them. They were wrong. First Lieutenant George Cannon commanded Battery H, defending the southern approach to Midway's airfield, when a shell tore through his post, destroying his left leg and wounding him with shrapnel. Cannon refused to retreat. Despite blood loss and agony, he continued issuing fire commands for 40 minutes, keeping his battery operational and scoring hits against the Japanese destroyers. Both ships were damaged and forced to withdraw earlier than planned. Cannon would soon lose consciousness and die. But at 26, he became the first Marine of World War II awarded the Medal of Honor. His heroism was documented. Yet the Japanese overconfidence that had made their assault possible remained invisible in official reports. This pattern repeated throughout the Pacific. Japan won, but never as easily as anticipated. Wake Island resisted far longer than expected, consuming men and supplies for months. Even defeated garrisons inflicted unplanned damage. Each so-called victory came at a price Tokyo had not fully accounted for. Meanwhile, Admiral Chester Nimitz of the United States Navy studied these patterns. He saw Japan's victories as tactical, not strategic. Supply lines were stretched thin, carrier pilots irreplaceable, forces dispersed across vast distances. And it's something the Japanese lacked: intelligence and the men who made it actionable. Joseph Roffert, born in Dayton, Ohio, in 1900, had joined the Navy during World War I without finishing high school. Through sheer talent and determination, he earned a commission, discovering a knack for intelligence work. Fluent in Japanese, versed in culture and cryptanalysis, he led Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, a cramped basement with 40 analysts, linguists, clerks, radio operators, and even musicians who Roffert believed could instinctively understand patterns. Breaking JN-25B was painstaking. Messages arrived as meaningless strings of numbers. Tables changed constantly, and partial decrypts required both linguistic insight and cultural understanding. By June 1942, Station Hypo could read only a fraction of Japanese naval traffic, but that fraction was enough to save lives, even to change the course of the war. By early May, Roffert noticed a sudden spike in Japanese communication, referring to a major operation in early June. The target was coded as AF, an ambiguous designation, but cross-referencing weather reports, reconnaissance notes, and other intelligence strongly pointed to Midway. Washington disagreed. Analysts guessed anywhere from Hawaii to the U.S. West Coast. Nimitz faced a critical choice: concentrate his carriers and risk being wrong, or disperse and risk annihilation. Roffert proposed a daring solution: a deception. Midway would transmit an unencrypted message about a water shortage. If Japanese intelligence intercepted it and reported back, Hypo could decode it. When the Japanese reported AF was running low on water, Midway was confirmed as a target. On May 22nd, Midway sent a plain English message, and 2 days later, the Japanese confirmed the island's shortage through JN-25B. Nimitz could act decisively, positioning all three carriers northeast of Midway in an ambush. Meanwhile, the carrier Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor, badly damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea. Engineers estimated 90 days of repair. Nimitz demanded 72. A swarm of 1,400 shipyard workers worked nonstop, welding, patching, restoring, and cutting away twisted steel. On May 30th, Yorktown put to sea with repairs still underway, joining Enterprise and Hornet at a designated rendezvous point northeast of Midway. The American fleet numbered 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and about 233 aircraft, facing a Japanese force of 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, numerous battleships, and more than 248 aircraft. Outnumbered, they held one advantage Japan could never anticipate: foreknowledge. Intelligence had revealed when and where the Japanese would strike, allowing Nimitz to set the stage for an ambush that would change the Pacific War forever. By mid-morning on June 4th, the American dive bombers had executed their attacks with devastating precision, but the chaos of battle was far from over. Torpedo squadrons and the carriers had already been decimated, suffering near total losses as Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore through their formations. The sacrifice of these men, however, was not in vain. Their attacks forced Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the fleet exposed from above. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, and Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from Yorktown exemplified the courage and skill that turned the tide. Best dive bombing runs struck Akagi and Kaga, igniting massive fires and detonations. Leslie's bombs hit Soryu with catastrophic effect. Within minutes, the carriers that had once represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval power were ablaze, their air wings destroyed before they could be launched. Admiral Nagumo, observing the destruction from his light cruiser Nagara, faced disbelief. For months, he had commanded a fleet that seemed invincible. Yet in a matter of minutes, American dive bombers had shattered his offensive. Every assumption he had made about American capabilities, predictable responses, poorly trained pilots, slow intelligence, had proven disastrously wrong. Unbeknownst to him, Joseph Roffert and Station Hypo had provided the United States with a decisive advantage: complete insight into Japanese movements, plans, and timing. Meanwhile, the remaining Japanese carrier Hiryu retaliated. It launched strikes against Yorktown, scoring serious damage. However, Later that afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise located Hiryu and delivered the fatal blow. By the evening of June 4th, all 4 Japan's carriers involved in Pearl Harbor were neutralized. 3 destroyed, 1 fatally damaged. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had irrevocably shifted to the United States. The Battle of Midway was not merely a tactical victory. It shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and altered Japanese military doctrine. Aircraft carriers were recognized as the decisive force of naval warfare, eclipsing the battleship in strategic importance. Dispersed fleet formations were reevaluated, as Midway demonstrated the fatal vulnerability of isolated units to concentrated attacks. And perhaps most importantly, Japan's perception of American capability changed fundamentally. The human cost of the Americans was high, but far outweighed by the gains. The bravery of torpedo crews, dive bomber pilots, and carrier air groups created opportunities that intelligence alone could not achieve. W.D. McCluskey returned to Enterprise in his heavily damaged SBD Dauntless, barely making it back with minimal fuel, while Richard Best's exposure to contaminated oxygen would end his combat career prematurely. Yet these personal sacrifices, combined with the meticulous intelligence work of Roffert and Station Hypo, ensured a victory that reshaped the Pacific theater. By the end of the day, the United States had proven that courage alone could not win wars. It was intelligence, preparation, and the disciplined execution of complex plans under extreme pressure that turned the tide. Midway became the turning point in the Pacific War, setting the stage for the island-hopping campaigns and the eventual defeat of Japan. In the days following the Battle of Midway, the strategic shockwaves reverberated across the Pacific. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and thousands of experienced pilots, men whose skill, training, and combat experience could never be fully replaced. The loss of these seasoned aviators was particularly catastrophic. The Japanese Naval Air Training Program could produce replacements, but not men of equal ability. The institutional knowledge lost at Midway, tactics honed over years of victories, was gone forever, and with it, Japan's ability to project naval power with the same confidence. Meanwhile, American forces were beginning to capitalize on their newfound advantage. Despite the damage Yorktown had sustained at Midway, the United States Navy now held the strategic initiative. The 3 remaining operational carriers, supported by cruisers, destroyers, and a growing air fleet, could dictate the pace of operations. Admiral Chester Nimitz, understanding the significance of the victory, shifted focus to offensive operations, knowing the Japanese were now reacting, scrambling to recover, and no longer leading the conflict. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders was profound. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's strategy, realized that his assumptions about American inefficiency and predictability had been decisively disproven. Japanese officers, steeped in a culture that valued honor, courage, and spiritual superiority, were forced to confront the limits of these traits when measured against superior intelligence, industrial power, and disciplined execution. The lessons of Midway forced a recalibration of doctrine, but changes were slow and inconsistent. Dispersed formations remained in use, often leaving units vulnerable to concentrated counterattacks. Midway also highlighted the human dimension of war. American torpedo squadrons were almost annihilated, yet their sacrifice drew Japanese air defenses down to sea level, clearing the way for the dive bombers that would deliver decisive strikes. Pilots like Lieutenant Commander W.D. McCluskey and Lieutenant Richard Best embodied the courage, ingenuity, and resolve that turned intelligence into action. McCluskey, despite being wounded and flying a severely damaged aircraft, returned to Enterprise with barely any fuel left, while Best, despite suffering permanent lung damage from a faulty oxygen canister, achieved multiple confirmed hits on enemy carriers. Their heroism was inseparable from the intelligence that had guided them, proving that victory relied on both knowledge and action in tandem. The repercussions of Midway extended far beyond the battle itself. Japan's forward momentum was halted, and for the first time, the United States could plan offensives with confidence. The island-hopping strategy, which would later see forces seize strategic points across the Pacific while bypassing heavily fortified positions, was made possible by this shift. Every subsequent engagement, from the Solomon Islands to the Central Pacific, was conducted with the lessons of Midway etched in the minds of American commanders, Intelligence was the ultimate force multiplier, and every calculated risk had to be leveraged to exploit enemy vulnerabilities. Station Hypo, under the leadership of Joseph Roffert, had played an indispensable role by breaking the Japanese JN-25B code, confirming Midway as a target, and providing precise timing for American forces. They created a scenario where intelligence dictated the battlefield. Roffert and his team worked in the shadows, often unrecognized, yet their efforts ensured that American pilots and commanders had the information necessary to act decisively. Without their work, the carriers could have missed the Japanese fleet entirely, and the war in the Pacific might have dragged on with far higher casualties. Even the death of Yamamoto in April 1943 can be traced back to these intelligence efforts. By intercepting his movements through JN-25B and authorizing an operation to ambush him, Nimitz struck a psychological blow against the Japanese command. Yamamoto's death was not militarily decisive in isolation, but it removed a strategist who truly understood both Japanese strengths and American potential, leaving Japan further disadvantaged in planning and morale. Following the Battle of Midway, the Pacific theater of World War II entered a new phase. The initiative had shifted decisively to the United States, and Japanese forces were forced into a defensive posture for the first time in nearly 2 years. Every operation Japan launched thereafter was reactionary, constrained by losses in carriers, aircraft, and seasoned pilots that could not be quickly replaced. This imbalance allowed American commanders to take calculated risks, exploiting the gaps left by overextended Japanese forces while maintaining the integrity of their own supply lines and operational planning. The lessons of Midway became the blueprint for subsequent American campaigns. The island-hopping strategy, which bypassed heavily fortified Japanese strongholds in favor of strategically valuable positions, was executed with precision. By capturing key islands such as Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and later Saipan, American forces could secure airfields and naval bases necessary to project power across the Pacific. Japanese resistance was fierce, but these engagements exposed their inability to recover operationally from carrier losses and diminished aircrew experience. The cumulative effect of attrition eroded Japan's capacity to respond effectively, stretching their defensive lines beyond sustainable limits. American intelligence continued to play a decisive role. Station Hypo's codebreakers, building on the work of Joseph Roffert, maintain a level of insight into Japanese operations that Japan could neither predict nor counter. The ability to anticipate enemy movements, confirm targets, and coordinate strikes with precision allowed the United States to conserve resources while inflicting maximum damage. For example, during the Guadalcanal campaign, intelligence enabled preemptive strikes against Japanese resupply convoys and provided critical warnings about enemy movements, turning what might have been chaotic engagements into strategically advantageous encounters. The human cost of these operations was enormous, but American losses could be absorbed and replenished by the industrial capacity of the United States. Japan, by contrast, faced severe limitations. Experienced pilots were irreplaceable. Shipbuilding could not match attrition, and material shortages hampered both repair and production. Midway had not only destroyed 4 carriers, but had also irreversibly weakened Japan's strategic reach. Every subsequent battle reinforced this disadvantage, and American forces learned to combine intelligence, technology, and tactical innovation in ways Japan could not effectively counter. Perhaps the most profound consequence of Midway was psychological. Japanese naval commanders, previously confident in their superiority, now understood that their assumptions about American weakness were no longer valid. This awareness fundamentally altered Japanese planning and decision-making. They became cautious, dispersed forces in an attempt to mitigate risk, and hesitated to commit fully to offensive operations. Conversely, American commanders, emboldened by their success, grew more willing to gamble on intelligence-driven strategies, knowing that a combination of superior information and disciplined execution provided a decisive edge. Heroes of Midway continued to shape these operations. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, despite being permanently grounded due to lung damage, contributed to the training of new dive bomber pilots, ensuring that hard-won tactics were passed on. McCluskey's experiences informed operational doctrine for overwater navigation, attack coordination, and fuel management under extreme pressure. Their actions became part of a broader narrative that emphasized the value of courage, persistence, and improvisation when paired with reliable intelligence. The strategic importance of Midway extended beyond the immediate theater of operations. By halting Japan's expansion and weakening its defensive capability, the United States set the stage for a global shift in momentum. European theaters, where American resources and strategy could now be applied more aggressively, benefited indirectly from the security of the Pacific. Industrial production, logistics, and strategic planning could be aligned without fear of catastrophic losses in the Pacific, giving the Allies a dual advantage in manpower and material. By late 1942 and into 1943, American forces had not only regained the initiative, but were systematically dismantling Japanese defensive positions across the Central and South Pacific. Each success reinforced the lessons learned at Midway. Intelligence is power, timing is critical, and courage under fire must be coupled with precise planning. The battle had proven that even a smaller force, if properly informed and strategically positioned, could overcome a numerically superior enemy. Midway was no longer just a turning point in one battle. It had become the foundation for a new doctrine of naval warfare in the Pacific. The aftermath of Midway reshaped not only the Pacific War, but the very understanding of modern naval combat. Japan's losses, for carriers, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of trained personnel, were irrecoverable. For the first time, the Imperial Japanese Navy confronted a reality in which courage and tradition alone could not secure victory. Their pilots, once considered invincible, were now matched or exceeded by American aviators who combined skill with intelligence, training, and technological advantage. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese commanders no longer assumed the United States would respond predictably or slowly, and the aura of invincibility that had guided Japanese strategy for nearly 2 years was shattered. American forces capitalized on this newfound momentum. Nimitz, with the insight provided by Station Hypo, directed campaigns with unprecedented precision. Guadalcanal became the first test of American strategic endurance, as island after island was secured using a combination of intelligence-driven strikes, coordinated naval and air attacks, and overwhelming logistical support. Every engagement reinforced a simple yet critical truth. Information, when leveraged effectively, could multiply the effectiveness of forces far beyond their raw numbers. The sacrifices of dive bomber crews, torpedo squadrons, and reconnaissance pilots were validated in every subsequent success. The story of Midway also highlighted the unsung heroes behind the scenes. Joseph Rofford and his codebreakers had ensured that American forces knew the enemy's location, intentions, and timing. Without their tireless work in the windowless basement of Station Hypo, the ambush at Midway would have been impossible. Pilots like McCluskey and Best executed those plans with extraordinary courage, navigating unknown waters, pressing attacks under fire, and improvising in real time to exploit fleeting opportunities. Their combined efforts demonstrate the interdependence of intelligence and action, planning and bravery, foresight and execution. Strategically, Midway marked a permanent shift of initiative in the Pacific from Japan to the United States. Every major Japanese operation after June 1942 was reactive, constrained, and less effective. American carriers, with secure communications and coordinated strategies, dictated the pace of engagements, selecting the time and place of combat to maximize advantage. This strategic flexibility allowed the United States to execute the island-hopping campaign, bypassing heavily fortified positions while isolating and neutralizing enemy strongholds. Japan, despite its tactical skill, was unable to match the combination of intelligence, logistics, and industrial capacity that the United States brought to bear. The personal stories of Midway's participants underscore the human cost and valor inherent in the battle. McCluskey returned with a bullet-riddled aircraft and nearly exhausted fuel, but had helped secure victory. Best achieved multiple carrier kills in a single day, sacrificing his health and ending his combat career prematurely. The torpedo squadrons, nearly annihilated, created the opening that allowed dive bombers to strike decisively. These acts of courage, guided by insight and preparation, exemplify the blend of human determination and strategic advantage that defines true turning points in history. Midway also reshaped Japanese naval doctrine permanently, albeit too late to recover. Carrier warfare became the central focus of Japanese strategy, replacing battleship-centered doctrine. Dispersed formations, once thought to provide tactical flexibility, were reevaluated in favor of more concentrated, defensible configurations. Japanese recognition of American tactical competence and adaptability gradually increased, though industrial and logistical limitations continue to hamper their ability to respond effectively. Meanwhile, the United States incorporated the lessons of intelligence, reconnaissance, and inter-service coordination into the broader framework of Pacific operations. Ultimately, the Battle of Midway demonstrates that the course of wars is not determined by fate or inevitability, but by preparation, intelligence, and decisive action. Men like Roffert, McCluskey, Best, and the countless others who acted under pressure, often risking life and limb, turned knowledge into decisive advantage. Midway was won in basements decoding enemy messages, in aircraft navigating endless ocean, and in pilots choosing courage over retreat. The outcome of June 4th, 1942, was a testament to the combination of intellect, bravery, and calculated risk, elements that together shifted the strategic balance in favor of the Allies, set the stage for future victories, and ultimately contributed to Japan's defeat in 1945. As we reflect on Midway, it is clear that history is shaped by those who see beyond the immediate, who act decisively under uncertainty, and who leverage every advantage available. The lessons of intelligence, foresight, and courage continue to resonate, offering insights not just into military strategy, but into leadership, decision-making, and the importance of preparation in the face of overwhelming odds. By understanding the human and intellectual elements behind Midway, we gain a deeper appreciation for how wars are won, and for the sacrifices that make victory possible. If this story resonated with you, consider liking this video to help us continue sharing forgotten narratives of World War II. Subscribe to stay connected with untold histories, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Together, we honor the courage, ingenuity, and resilience of those who shaped the course of history.